Former Marine Marcus Coleman thought the war was over. His night shift at Baltimore Harbor was quiet. No gunfire, no orders, just silence and rain. But when he warned of a danger no one wanted to hear, his words were erased, his diary rewound, and by the next morning, he was handcuffed. They needed someone to blame. They chose the man who kept his composure. What they forgot was, some soldiers don't stop fighting when they take off their uniforms. Before we begin, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe that some heroes are willing to look criminal to save innocent people, then this story is for you. Baltimore, Maryland, was drowning in cold rain. The kind that turns streetlights into blurred halos and makes the harbor smell like iron and salt. Wind pushed low clouds over the port of Baltimore, and the container cranes stood like black skeletons against the wet night. Marcus Coleman moved through the security office like he belonged to the darkness. He was 31, tall and powerfully built, broad shoulders packed into a simple black jacket, thick forearms marked by old training scars. His skin was a deep brown, his head kept close cropped, and his face held that calm, unreadable discipline you see in men who've learned to breathe through chaos. Marcus didn't waste words. He didn't raise his voice. In the Marines, that kind of quiet wasn't softness, it was control. Tonight, control was the job. The security room hummed with monitors and low radio chatter. A coffee machine sputtered like it was giving up. On the wall, a map of the port showed lanes, gates, and the fenced maze of container yards, each one a small city of metal boxes. Marcus checked his watch. 2:17 a.m. Behind him, someone cleared their throat. Glenn Rourke, the shift supervisor, leaned in the doorway with a paper cup and a permanent scowl. Glenn was a white man in his mid-40s, average height but thick around the middle, with a receding hairline and a short, patchy beard that looked like it never grew in evenly. His eyes were pale and restless, the kind that flicked over people like they were problems to solve. Glenn's personality was built on shortcuts, charm when he needed something, irritation when he didn't. He'd climbed by, knowing who to please. "Coleman," Glenn said, like the name tasted bitter. "You still running the screens like we're at the Pentagon?" Marcus didn't turn. "We're under contract. Procedures are procedures." Glenn snorted. "It's a port, not a war zone." Marcus finally looked at him, steady, not hostile. Ports get hit, people just don't notice until it's too late. Glenn waved a hand as if dismissing the thought. "Just keep it moving. No drama. Corporate hates drama." Marcus didn't argue. He'd learned a long time ago that some men didn't hear warnings. They heard challenges. He turned back to the monitors. The rain tapped the window in thin, constant needles. Outside, floodlights painted the yard in harsh white, reflecting off wet asphalt and stacked containers. A row of cameras tracked the eastern container block, E17 through E24, a section that was usually quiet at this hour. Then a new sound cut through the steady hum. Beep! 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 A warning box flashed on Marcus's main screen. Motion sensor trip, East Block E-19. Marcus's posture sharpened instantly. Not panic. Focus. He clicked the camera feed for E19. The image stuttered once. The frame looked too clean, too still, like a photograph pretending to be a live video. Rain glittered in the light, but there was no visible movement. Marcus's eyes narrowed. That's not right. He pulled up the sensor panel. Another alert flickered. System latency, 4.8 seconds. He keyed his radio. Gate Patrol, this is Control. I need eyes on East Block E19. Confirm movement. The radio hissed. A tired voice replied. Copy, Control. We're a few minutes out. Marcus didn't like a few minutes when a sensor tripped in a quiet yard. He opened the access logs. The system showed a maintenance ping. Scheduled? No, It wasn't on tonight's list. He turned toward the tech station where a young man sat half-hidden behind a laptop and a coil of cables. Luis Herrera looked up, startled. He was 19, Latino, slim and slightly underweight with messy black hair that fell into his eyes no matter how often he brushed it back. His face still had that soft youthfulness of someone not fully hardened by adulthood yet, but his eyes were sharp. Always watching, always calculating. Luis was a junior systems tech, smart enough to fix problems older men didn't even understand. He'd grown up taking care of a sick mother and younger siblings, which had carved a caution into his personality. Luis didn't pick fights. He survived them. "Luis," Marcus said, voice low, "is there maintenance on East Block cameras tonight?" Luis blinked fast, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Not that I know of. The schedule didn't." Marcus pointed to the latency reading. "Explain that." Luis leaned in, shoulders tense. That shouldn't be happening. The feed is buffered, like it's being routed," Marcus finished. Luis swallowed. "Yeah." Glenn heard the beeping and wandered back, irritation rising. "What now?" Marcus kept his tone even. "Motion trip at E19. Camera feed is buffered. I want to lock down East Block until we confirm." Glenn frowned like Marcus had asked him to personally stand in the rain. "Lockdown? You know what a lockdown does to shipping schedules? It protects the yard. It slows everything." Glenn jabbed a finger toward the monitors. "It's probably a raccoon, or wind, or rain. The sensors are junk." Marcus didn't flinch. "Then we confirm and reopen. 10 minutes." Glenn's eyes hardened. "No." He sipped his coffee. "Do your report. Don't shut down my lanes without permission." Marcus stared at Glenn for one long second. Not anger, measurement. "Protocol says." "I don't care what it says," Glenn cut in, voice rising. "Corporate wants flow. Flow is money. You want to play hero? Do it on your own time." Luis looked down, fast, pretending to be absorbed in his screen, but Marcus saw the tension in the kid's jaw. Marcus turned back to the system. He could have ignored Glenn and pulled the lockdown anyway. Marcus had the clearance, but he also knew exactly how that story would be told later. Coleman disrupted operations. Coleman overreacted. Coleman caused losses. Systems like this didn't punish the reckless. They punished the careful. So Marcus chose the only weapon that couldn't be twisted as easily: documentation. He opened an incident report and typed, slowly and clearly, 0217, motion sensor trip E-19, camera feed latency observed, possible routing or buffering anomaly, requested East Block lockdown for verification, request denied by Supervisor Glenn Rourke. He saved it. Then, to make sure it couldn't vanish quietly, he tagged it for automatic forwarding to the internal compliance mailbox. Glenn watched him, lips pressed thin. "You done?" Marcus answered without looking up. "Not yet." He keyed the radio again. "Gate patrol. Status." The response came faster this time, sharper. "Control. East Block gate is open. It shouldn't be. We see movement between containers." Marcus's heartbeat stayed steady, but his eyes turned cold. "Confirm if it's authorized." "Negative," the voice said. "No badge scan logged at the gate." Glenn's face twitched. "What?" Marcus didn't wait. "All units, this is control. East Block unauthorized movement. Do not engage alone. Approach with caution." Glenn stepped forward, suddenly nervous. "Why didn't you lock it down?" Marcus's gaze cut to him. "I asked." Glenn opened his mouth, but no words came out. He turned away like he could outrun responsibility. The next 10 minutes unfolded like a slow-motion collapse. The patrol units moved in, but the yard was a maze. Containers stacked high, shadows thick, rain blinding. On Marcus's screen, camera feeds flickered one by one, some freezing, others going black entirely. The sensor panel lit up like a Christmas tree. Movement, tamper alerts, signal interruptions. Then, a final alert flashed in red. Security breach. Cargo loss potential. Marcus felt something shift in his stomach, not fear. Recognition. This wasn't random, it was coordinated. The radio crackled with chaos. Control, we lost sight. Someone cut through the fence line. Another voice. They're heading north. Vehicle waiting. Marcus's hands moved with precision, pulling up gate controls, tracking the few cameras still alive, trying to box in the exit routes. But someone was always one step ahead. By 3:06, it was over. The yard fell quiet again, the rain returning to its steady tapping as if the night itself had decided to forget what happened. Glenn stood behind Marcus, pale now, coffee forgotten. How bad? Marcus stared at the inventory panel as numbers updated. Bad. Can we fix it? Glenn asked, voice thin. Marcus didn't answer. He already knew what came next. Not the investigation. Not the truth. The blame. Morning arrived gray and heavy. The rain eased into a mist and the port looked washed out like the color had been drained from it. Marcus walked into the security office for the debrief expecting hard questions. He expected pressure. He even expected anger. He did not expect handcuffs. 2 uniformed police officers stood near the desk. Both white, both built like they worked out more than they slept. Officer Daniel Keene was tall, with a squared jaw and close-shaved blonde hair. His expression was professional, but his eyes held a faint, impatient judgment. Officer Brian Sutter was shorter and thicker through the chest, brown hair cropped tight, a smirk that came and went like he enjoyed the power of the moment. Glenn was there too, arms crossed, not meeting Marcus's gaze. A man in a suit stepped forward. Thomas Vance, Internal Investigations. Mid-50s, thin, with a sharp nose and wireframe glasses. His face carried no emotion at all, like he'd practiced removing it. Marcus Coleman, Vance said. You're being detained pending investigation for failure to act and negligence resulting in major loss. Marcus didn't move. My report? Vance lifted a folder. We have your report. Marcus exhaled once, controlled. Then you know I requested lockdown. Vance's mouth tightened. The record shows no lockdown request was authorized. Marcus's eyes flicked to Glenn, steady, not pleading. Glenn looked away. Officer Keene stepped in. Turn around. Marcus complied, not because he was weak, but because he understood something deeper. Fighting the cuffs would only give them the image they wanted. Cold metal closed around his wrists. The room felt smaller. The air felt heavier. Somewhere in the corner, Luis Herrera stood frozen with a clipboard in his hands, eyes wide with fear, watching the truth get folded neatly into a lie. Marcus raised his chin slightly. His face didn't change. No panic, no begging, no collapse. Only a hard, quiet focus. The same look he'd worn in darker places than this. As they led him toward the door, Glenn finally spoke, voice low like a confession he didn't intend to own. Should have just let it go, Coleman. Marcus turned his head just enough to meet him. Letting it go is how people get hurt. Then the door shut behind him, and the port, wet, busy, indifferent, kept moving like nothing had happened. The federal courthouse in downtown Baltimore rose from the wet pavement like a slab of cold stone, indifferent to weather and people alike. Inside, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper, the kind of place where time slowed but outcomes rarely did. Marcus Coleman was led through a side entrance in wrist restraints, his boots echoing softly against marble floors polished by decades of quiet authority. He walked upright, shoulders squared, eyes forward. He had worn heavier chains than these before. What weighed more was the silence around him. The courtroom filled quickly, almost too quickly, as if everyone already knew where they needed to be and how long they were allowed to stay. Rows of wooden benches creaked under the movement of spectators, most of them employees connected to the port, a few reporters scribbling notes, and several men in suits who did not introduce themselves to anyone. The seal of the United States hung behind the bench, large and unblinking. At the center sat Judge Richard Halverson. He was in his early 60s, heavy-set, with sloping shoulders that strained slightly against his black robe. His head was bald, except for a thin fringe of gray hair that clung stubbornly to the sides. His face was broad and pale, marked by permanent lines of impatience around the mouth. Halvorsen had a reputation for efficiency, a word his colleagues used politely and his critics used carefully. He disliked delays, disliked emotion, and disliked cases that asked him to look twice. He glanced down at the docket as if already tired of it. Case number 24-117, he said. United States versus Marcus Coleman. Let's proceed. The prosecutor rose immediately, almost eagerly. Jonathan Pierce was a man in his 40s, lean, clean-cut, with dark hair combed neatly to the side and a smile that never reached his eyes. He wore an expensive navy suit that fit like it had been tailored to make him look taller than he was. Pierce spoke with practiced confidence, the kind built on winning more than questioning. "Your Honor," Pierce began, "this is a straightforward case of negligence. The defendant, Marcus Coleman, was on duty as lead security officer during a significant breach at the Port of Baltimore. Evidence will show that he failed to act despite clear warning signs resulting in substantial loss." He gestured toward a large screen as exhibits appeared one by one, smooth and seamless. First, the shift report. Marcus's name sat at the bottom, his signature clean and unmistakable. Second, system data. Charts and timestamps highlighted a window of inaction, 7 minutes circled in red. Third, still frames from security footage. Empty lanes. Static images. Time codes frozen at the exact moment intrusion should have been caught. Pierce spoke as if narrating something already agreed upon. As you can see, the defendant did not initiate lockdown protocols. The cameras failed. The response was delayed. These failures occurred under his authority. Marcus listened without moving. He felt eyes on his back, measuring him, reducing him to bullet points on a screen. Then his attorney stood. Ethan Brooks was 28, tall but slim, his build more runner than fighter. He wore a charcoal gray suit that looked carefully chosen but slightly worn at the cuffs, as if it had already seen too many long days. His skin was dark, his hair kept short and neat, and his face held a seriousness that came less from age than from having learned early that mistakes were more expensive for some people than others. His eyes, sharp and observant, moved constantly, not nervously but actively, tracking the room, the judge, the prosecutor, the evidence. Ethan had grown up watching his father lose a job over a procedural misunderstanding that was never corrected. That memory had shaped him into someone who trusted paperwork less than patterns. "Your Honor," Ethan said calmly, "the defense would like to request access to the original system logs, including back-end metadata to verify—" Halverson raised a hand without looking at him. "Denied." Ethan paused, surprised but composed. "Respectfully, Your Honor, the defense has a right to examine—" "This court does not entertain speculation," Halverson snapped, finally lifting his eyes. "We deal in facts, not theories." A ripple moved through the room, subtle but unmistakable. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing the message. "Understood, Your Honor." He turned briefly toward Marcus. "Mr. Coleman," he said, "did you receive any alerts that night?" Marcus met the judge's gaze when he spoke, his voice steady and low. "Yes." "And did you act on them?" "I followed procedure. I requested a lockdown." Pierce was already on his feet. "Objection. Self-serving statement." Halverson struck the gavel once. "Sustained." Marcus added only one sentence before the moment closed. "I warned them." Silence settled, heavy and deliberate. From the gallery, Rachel Moore watched closely. She was in her mid-30s, average height with a lean frame and sharp cheekbones that gave her a permanently alert expression. Her brown hair was pulled into a low ponytail, practical rather than stylish, and she wore a plain coat over jeans. Nothing that suggested press, though the notebook in her lap told a different story. Rachel had once believed institutions corrected themselves. Then she'd covered too many stories where they didn't. Since then, she trusted data and patterns more than official statements, and something about this case felt rehearsed. She wrote down the judge's name and circled it. Not far away, Luis Herrera sat rigidly in his chair, hands clasped too tightly in his lap. He wore a borrowed suit jacket that didn't quite fit his narrow shoulders. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor. Earlier that morning, a man from internal compliance had pulled him aside in a hallway and spoken softly, almost kindly. "You don't need to get involved," the man had said. "Technical matters confuse juries. Best to let the lawyers handle it." Luis had nodded, fear drying his mouth. He knew what that tone meant. Back at the bench, Pierce continued, laying out the timeline with clinical precision. Every slide flowed into the next. No contradictions, no gaps, at least none visible. Halverson leaned back slightly, hands folded, expression unchanged. Ethan rose again, carefully. "Your Honor, the defense notes that the system data presented appears summarized. Without access to raw logs, we cannot—" Halverson cut him off. "Counsel, you've made your point. Move on." Ethan did, outwardly compliant, inwardly unsettled. The case felt sealed before it had begun. Too clean, too aligned. In his briefcase, the printed reports he'd reviewed the night before suddenly felt lighter, less reliable. The prosecutor rested. The judge glanced at the clock. "Given the clarity of evidence," Halverson said, "we will adjourn until closing statements tomorrow." The gavel came down, final and decisive. As the room stirred, officers moved toward Marcus. He stood without prompting, calm as ever, cuffs glinting under fluorescent lights. Rachel watched him closely. There was no collapse in his posture, no visible fear, only restraint. Ethan caught up to him near the door. "We're not done," he said quietly. Marcus nodded once. "I know." Outside, rain began again, light but persistent, streaking down the courthouse steps as if trying to wash something away that refused to move. The holding facility on the edge of Baltimore sat low and gray, a converted federal building that smelled of bleach and stale air. Marcus Coleman spent the night on a narrow bunk, hands free now, but freedom still far away. The fluorescent light above never fully dimmed, humming softly like an insect that refused to sleep. Marcus lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, breathing slow and even. Years in the Marines had trained his body to rest anywhere. His mind, however, refused. Across the city, Ethan Brooks hadn't slept at all. He sat at the small dining table of his apartment, laptop open, papers spread out in uneven stacks. Outside his window, early morning traffic hissed over wet pavement. Ethan had changed out of his courtroom suit into a wrinkled t-shirt and jeans, but his posture was still rigid, shoulders slightly forward as if bracing for impact. His face looked younger in the dim light, though the dark circles under his eyes told a different story. Ethan wasn't reading the report anymore. He was dissecting it. He had exported the security file data earlier under a standard discovery copy. Summarized logs, not raw. That limitation bothered him. Still, metadata was stubborn. It remembered things people tried to forget. He clicked into the file properties again. Creation date, modification date, access history. His fingers froze. The incident log, officially generated during the breach, had a creation timestamp that didn't match the night of the intrusion. It had been created nearly 12 hours later. "That's not possible," Ethan muttered. He cross-checked another file. Same anomaly. Then another. Patterns emerged. Not random. Consistent. Ethan leaned back, heart beginning to beat faster. "You don't recreate logs unless you're replacing something," he said to the empty room. He pulled up a system standards manual for the port's security software. According to protocol, any overwrite triggered an automatic alert and required dual authorization. Yet there was no record of such an alert. Someone hadn't just edited the data. They'd bypassed the safeguards. Ethan grabbed his phone and hesitated before dialing. Luis Herrera answered on the fourth ring. His voice was tight. "Hello? Luis, it's Ethan Brooks. We met at the courthouse." A pause. "I know." "I need to ask you something," Ethan said carefully, "and you don't have to answer if you don't want to." Another pause, longer this time. In the background, Ethan heard the faint clatter of dishes, a television murmuring in Spanish. Luis finally spoke, his words low. "They told me not to talk to you." "Who is they?" Luis exhaled shakily. "People who don't leave business cards." Ethan softened his tone. "I'm not asking you to speculate, I'm asking about systems, about how logs work." Silence pressed in. Then Luis said quietly, "Somebody issued a manual overwrite command. That doesn't happen by accident." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "Was it authorized?" "No," Luis said. "Not officially." "Did someone order it?" Luis swallowed. "Yes." Ethan waited. "They told me the cameras were glitching," Luis continued. "Said I should reroute the feed temporarily and not document it, just for a few minutes." "Who told you?" Luis hesitated, fear audible in his breathing. "I can't say names." Ethan didn't push. "When was the overwrite executed?" "After the breach," Luis said. "Hours after." That was all Ethan needed. "Luis," Ethan said gently, "they're building a case on that data." "I know," Luis whispered. "That's why I can't sleep." Across town, Marcus was called into a small interview room. A single metal table, 2 chairs, a camera bolted into the corner. He sat calmly as Angela Reed entered. She was an internal review officer in her early 40s, tall and slim, with tightly braided hair pulled back into a severe bun. Her suit was modest, her expression professional but distant. Angela had built her career on neutrality, or at least the appearance of it. She sat across from Marcus and folded her hands. "Mr. Coleman, this doesn't have to go the hard way." Marcus met her eyes. "I didn't choose the hard way." She slid a folder toward him. "If you accept responsibility for procedural delay, the prosecution is willing to recommend a reduced sentence. No prison time, probation. You keep your record, mostly intact." Marcus didn't touch the folder. "You want me to lie?" Angela's jaw tightened. "I want this resolved." Marcus leaned back slightly, chains softly clinking against the chair legs. "I warned them. I documented it. I won't say I failed just to make this cleaner." Angela studied him for a moment, something unreadable flickering across her face. She'd seen men fold. She'd seen men rage. Marcus did neither. "Think about it," she said finally, standing. "This system doesn't reward martyrs." Marcus watched her leave. "Neither does the truth," he said quietly to the empty room. "But it survives." Later that afternoon, Rachel Moore sat in her car outside a glass-fronted office building overlooking the harbor. The sign near the entrance read, "Harbor Shield Security Solutions." Rachel was patient by nature. She had learned that from years of waiting for sources to return calls they'd promised to make. She wore sunglasses, her hair loose now, falling around her shoulders. In her notebook, she had written a timeline. Breach, Tuesday night. Contract announcement, Thursday morning. Harbor Shield had just been awarded a multi-million-dollar contract to upgrade port security. Emergency procurement, no competitive bidding. Rachel frowned. "That's fast," she murmured. She snapped photos of employees entering and leaving, not because she needed faces, but because she needed movement. Money followed movement. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Check their previous contracts. Same pattern. A friend, Rachel smiled thinly. Someone else was paying attention. That evening, Ethan received an email with no subject line. Inside was a single sentence and a phone number. "I used to run security before Coleman. They blamed me for a failure I warned about too." The call connected to Frank Delaney, a former port supervisor in his late 50s. Frank's voice was gravelly, worn down by years of cigarette smoke and disappointment. He described himself plainly. Average height, bad knees, no patience for bullshit. "They didn't fire me," Frank said. "They pushed me out. Same playbook. Ignore warning. Something breaks. Find someone easy to sacrifice." "Why contact me now?" Ethan asked. "Because this time it's too clean," Frank replied. "And because Coleman didn't cave." Ethan scribbled notes furiously. "Would you testify?" A pause. "Not yet," Frank said, "but I can point you where the bones are buried." By nightfall, Ethan sat back at his table, overwhelmed but certain. The case wasn't just flawed, it was engineered. He drafted a motion requesting forensic review of the metadata, careful with language, precise. He attached supporting documentation, system manuals, and sworn statements, anonymous for now. Across the city, Marcus lay back on his bunk again. Somewhere beyond the walls, rain returned, tapping lightly against barred windows. He closed his eyes, not in surrender, but in preparation. The truth was there. He could feel it moving, slow but deliberate, like a tide that didn't care how long it took to reach shore. The second day of proceedings began under a dull, colorless sky. Baltimore felt heavier that morning, the kind of weight that settled into concrete and bone alike. Outside the federal courthouse, a small cluster of reporters had gathered. Nothing dramatic yet, but enough to signal that the case had begun to breathe beyond its walls. Inside, the courtroom lights were harsh and unforgiving, washing faces into pale masks and leaving nowhere to hide. Marcus Coleman sat at the defense table, hands folded, posture straight. The orange jumpsuit had been replaced by a simple gray suit issued for court appearances. It didn't fit him perfectly at the shoulders, but he wore it the same way he wore everything else, with quiet dignity. He had slept little, but it didn't show. Discipline had taught him how to hold the line when the body wanted to sag. Across the aisle, Ethan Brooks stood and adjusted his jacket. He looked calm, but the tension lived in the way his jaw tightened before he spoke. Today was different. He wasn't just defending a man anymore. He was pushing against a system that had decided it didn't want to hear him. "Your Honor," Ethan began, voice measured, "the defense calls Luis Herrera to the stand." For a brief second, the room seemed to pause. Judge Richard Halverson lifted his eyes slowly, irritation already carved into his expression. "Denied." Ethan blinked once. "Respectfully, Your Honor, Mr. Herrera is a systems technician directly involved in—" Halverson cut him off sharply. "Counsel, you are attempting to relitigate issues already addressed. This witness is unnecessary." Ethan took a breath. He is necessary because he can testify to the integrity, or lack thereof, of the security logs used by the prosecution. Jonathan Pierce rose smoothly. "Objection. This is an attempt to confuse the jury with technical conjecture." Halverson didn't hesitate. Sustained. The gavel struck, harder than before. "Mr. Brooks," Halverson said coldly, "you are diluting this courtroom with speculation. One more attempt to derail proceedings and I will consider sanctions. Am I clear?" Ethan felt heat rise in his chest, but he nodded. "Perfectly clear, Your Honor." Marcus watched the exchange without moving. He recognized the tone. He'd heard it before, from officers who didn't want problems, from superiors who mistook obedience for loyalty. This wasn't about law. It was about control. As Ethan returned to his seat, his phone vibrated silently in his pocket. He didn't look. He already knew something was happening. Across town, Rachel Moore hit publish. Her article went live at 9:14 a.m. The headline was simple, sharp, and impossible to ignore. Millions awarded after the breach. Inside the port security contract, no one questioned. Rachel had written it with precision. No accusations she couldn't back, no dramatic language. Just timelines, documents, and numbers that didn't sit right when placed next to each other. She described Harbor Shield's sudden contract approval, the lack of competitive bidding, and the convenient timing, mere hours after the breach that Marcus Coleman now stood accused of enabling. Rachel herself appeared only briefly in the story, identified as an independent investigative journalist. Those who knew her understood why she stayed out of the spotlight. Years ago, early in her career, she had trusted an editor who killed a story to protect advertisers. Since then, Rachel trusted facts more than institutions, and silence only when it protected a source. Within minutes, the article began to spread. Phones buzzed in the courtroom gallery. One reporter slipped quietly out, already dialing an editor. Another raised his eyebrows, reading fast. The air shifted, not loudly, but perceptibly. Jonathan Pierce noticed. He frowned, glancing toward the benches. Halverson did too. "Order," the judge snapped, tapping his gavel. "This is a courtroom, not a newsroom." But the attention had already turned. During a short recess, Ethan finally checked his phone. He read the headline once, then again, a slow smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Rachel had done exactly what he couldn't. She'd forced the case into the open. He stepped into the hallway, where fluorescent lights hummed and voices echoed off polished stone. That was when he saw the man standing near the far wall, holding a small black case by his feet. The man was in his late 50s or early 60s, tall but slightly stooped, with thinning gray hair and a face lined by years of fatigue rather than age. He wore a plain brown jacket over a button-down shirt, nothing that stood out. His hands, however, were steady. He met Ethan's eyes and nodded once. "Ethan Brooks?" he asked. "Yes." "My name's Samuel Klein," the man said. "I used to manage back-end systems for port security, before Harbor Shield, before all this." Samuel's voice was calm, almost flat. He had learned long ago that emotion invited dismissal. He'd been fired 5 years earlier after raising concerns about system vulnerabilities that would have required expensive fixes. The termination letter cited organizational restructuring. Samuel called it what it was: punishment for refusing to stay quiet. Ethan gestured to the case. "What's that?" Samuel knelt and opened it just enough to reveal a rugged external hard drive. Redundant backups, stored off network. They forgot about them when they changed vendors. Ethan felt his pulse spike. "How did you get past security?" Samuel held up a folded document. "Federal subpoena, issued this morning. I've been waiting for someone to ask the right questions for years." Back in the courtroom, proceedings resumed with a brittle tension running beneath every word. The prosecution continued as if nothing had changed, but their confidence had dulled. Halverson's impatience now carried a sharp edge, like a blade tested too often. Ethan stood again. "Your Honor," he said, "the defense submits newly obtained evidence under federal subpoena authority." Halverson's eyes narrowed. "What evidence?" Ethan held up the subpoena and gestured toward Samuel, now standing at the doorway. "Backup system data relevant to the integrity of the logs used by the prosecution." Pierce shot to his feet. "This is outrageous. We have not reviewed—" Halverson hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. But it was enough. "Bring it forward," the judge said reluctantly. "We will determine admissibility." A murmur rippled through the room. Samuel walked in with measured steps, placing the hard drive on the clerk's desk. He did not look at Marcus. He did not look at the jury. He looked only at the judge. "I maintained those systems," Samuel said simply. "They don't lie unless someone forces them to." In the back row, Luis Herrera watched, heart pounding. He had expected to feel relief. Instead, fear washed over him. He knew what this meant. Lines were being crossed, and people who crossed lines didn't get promotions. During the next break, a man from Port Administration pulled Luis aside. His voice was low, urgent. "You don't want to get mixed up in this. Think about your future." Luis thought about his mother, about rent, about the nights he'd stared at the ceiling, knowing the truth was being buried with his silence. "I am thinking about my future," Luis said quietly. "That's why I can't lie." He stepped back into the courtroom when proceedings resumed, his hands trembling slightly, spine straightening with each step. He hadn't been called yet, but he would be. Marcus saw him and gave the smallest nod. No pressure, no demand, just acknowledgement. By the time court adjourned for the day, the story had spread beyond Baltimore. Social media buzzed. Editorials began drafting themselves. Outside, cameras lined the steps. Halverson left the bench tight-lipped, refusing questions. Ethan packed his briefcase slowly, mind racing but focused. The silence that had protected lies was cracking. And once cracked, it could not be forced back into place. Marcus was led away again, but this time, something had changed. The weight in the room was different. Less certain, less controlled. Silence was breaking, and everyone could hear it. The courtroom felt different the moment everyone returned to their seats. It wasn't louder and it wasn't quieter either. It was tense in a new way, like a room that had realized it might have been wrong and didn't yet know how to react. Outside, rain had stopped, leaving Baltimore wrapped in a damp gray stillness. Inside, the air felt brittle, stretched thin by expectation. Marcus Coleman sat motionless at the defense table. His hands rested flat, palms down, fingers relaxed. He had learned long ago that when the tide turned, it did so quietly at first. His face remained calm, but his eyes tracked every movement. The judge, the prosecutor, the clerk preparing equipment at the side of the room. This wasn't relief he felt. It was readiness. Ethan Brooks stood beside him, jacket unbuttoned now, posture straighter than it had been all week. He hadn't slept much, but exhaustion had sharpened him rather than dulled him. The folder in his hands looked unremarkable. Thin, almost fragile, but it carried the weight of everything that had been missing. Judge Richard Halverson entered without ceremony. He took his seat slowly, eyes lingering on the gallery, on the cluster of reporters now openly present, cameras waiting outside the doors. His face was tight, the impatience of earlier days replaced by something closer to caution. "Proceed," Halverson said curtly. Ethan didn't waste the opening. "Your Honor, the defense moves to enter evidence retrieved under federal subpoena authority. This includes redundant backup data from the port's former security management system." Jonathan Pierce remained seated. His expression was unreadable, lips pressed together, hands folded. It was the first time since the trial began that he didn't rise immediately to object. Ethan nodded toward the clerk, who connected the external hard drive Samuel Klein had delivered the day before. The screen at the front of the courtroom flickered, then filled with a clean interface. Older software, unmistakably different from the polished summaries the prosecution had presented earlier. Samuel Klein stood near the witness box. In the full light of the courtroom, he looked older than he had in the hallway the day before. His shoulders sloped slightly, the result of years hunched over server racks, and his hands bore faint scars from sharp metal edges and long hours of manual work. His voice, when he spoke, was steady but quiet. "These backups were created automatically," Samuel said. "They were stored off-network, disconnected from the live system. No one could modify them without physical access." Ethan gestured to the screen. "Please show the court the incident timeline." Samuel typed a short command. Lines of data appeared: timestamps, access requests, internal messages. The first highlighted entry appeared in bold. 2:18 a.m. Security Officer Marcus Coleman. Request for East Block lockdown due to sensor anomaly. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Marcus didn't react. He had lived with that truth long enough. Ethan continued. "Now show what followed." Another entry appeared. 2:19 a.m. Supervisor override. Request denied. Maintain operations. The name attached to the override flashed briefly before Samuel minimized the field. The court had seen enough to understand. Ethan's voice remained calm. "This confirms Mr. Coleman acted according to procedure." He moved to the next section. "Now the log modification." Samuel navigated deeper. The screen filled with system alerts. Alerts that had never been included in the prosecution's exhibits. 3:41 a.m. Manual overwrite command initiated. Authorization. Administrative level. Reason field. Blank. Ethan turned slightly toward the bench. "Your Honor, this overwrite occurred after the breach had concluded." Pierce finally stood slowly. "Objection. This data has not been independently verified." Halverson hesitated. He looked at the screen, then at the clerk, then back at Pierce. "Overruled. Verification is underway." Pierce's jaw tightened. He sat back down. Samuel continued. "Once overwritten, the system regenerated summary logs. Those are the logs you've been shown previously." Ethan nodded. "In other words, the logs used to accuse my client were created after the fact." "Yes," Samuel said, "and not by him." Ethan stepped back, letting the evidence speak. Judge Halverson leaned forward now, elbows on the bench. "Play the audio record." The clerk clicked once. The room filled with sound. Clean, unmistakable. Marcus's voice, steady and controlled. "Control to supervisor. East Block E19 showing latency and sensor anomalies. Requesting immediate lockdown to verify." A pause. Another voice followed. Male, firm, dismissive. Negative. Maintain flow. Do not escalate. The audio continued, time-stamped, unbroken. Then another moment, several minutes later. "We're losing visual," a voice said. "Ignore it," the supervisor responded. "We'll deal with the paperwork later." Silence followed, heavy and damning. When the audio ended, no one spoke. Pierce stared at the table in front of him, color drained from his face. The confidence that had carried him through the first days of trial had evaporated, leaving calculation behind. He knew the shift when it came. Every prosecutor did. Rachel Moore sat perfectly still in the gallery, hands folded over her notebook. She didn't write. She didn't need to. This was the moment she had been building toward. Later she would publish again, this time connecting names, contracts, and decision-makers in a chain that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. For now, she watched history correct itself inch by inch. Ethan pressed forward. "Your Honor, the defense submits that these backups demonstrate 3 facts. Mr. Coleman requested a lockdown, his supervisor denied it, and the logs were manually altered after the breach to conceal that denial." Halverson exhaled slowly. The sound was picked up faintly by the courtroom microphones. "Mr. Pierce," he said, "do you wish to respond?" Pierce stood, hesitated, then sat again. "No, Your Honor." The silence that followed was absolute. Halverson nodded once, sharply. "The court will admit the backup data in full. The jury will consider all original records." He paused, then added, his voice lower, more controlled. "The court also orders an immediate referral to federal investigators regarding potential evidence tampering." In the gallery, someone let out a breath they hadn't realized they were holding, Outside the courthouse, the effect was already rippling outward. Rachel's follow-up article went live within the hour, outlining the financial ties between Harbor Shield executives and port administrators who had approved the emergency contract. Names appeared, dates aligned. The story spread fast, carried by outrage rather than curiosity now. By mid-afternoon, federal agents arrived at Harbor Shield's headquarters. No spectacle, no sirens, just quiet men and women with badges and folders, stepping into offices where confidence had once been currency. Back in the courtroom, Marcus finally allowed himself to shift slightly in his chair. Not a smile. Just a release of tension so subtle only Ethan noticed. Ethan leaned toward him and spoke quietly. "They can't put it back." Marcus nodded. They never could. As proceedings adjourned for the day, Halverson left the bench without meeting anyone's eyes. The gavel sounded different this time, less decisive, more restrained. Marcus was led out again, but the walk felt shorter now. Lighter. Not because he was free, he wasn't yet, but because the truth had finally entered the room and refused to leave. The original file had spoken, and nothing would be the same again. The final morning arrived without ceremony. Baltimore woke under a pale sun that slipped through broken clouds, warming the stone steps of the federal courthouse just enough to lift the chill. People gathered early this time. Reporters with cameras slung low, clerks with folders hugged to their chests, a few port workers who had watched the story unfold from a distance and now wanted to see it end. Inside, the courtroom settled into a careful stillness, as if everyone sensed that noise would only cheapen what was about to happen. Marcus Coleman stood when instructed, his shoulders squared, his breathing slow. He wore the same gray suit as before, the fabric creased at the elbows now from days of sitting and standing waiting. The cuffs were still there, cool against his wrists, but he no longer felt them as a judgment. They were just metal, temporary, removable, irrelevant to the truth that had already found its voice. Judge Richard Halverson entered and took his seat with an expression that was neither stern nor apologetic, only measured. He looked older today, the lines on his face deeper, the weight of the bench more visible in the way he adjusted his robe. The court clerk called the room to order, and the hum of conversation died instantly. Halverson glanced at the file, then out at the room. "We will proceed with the court's ruling." Jonathan Pierce stood briefly, then sat again, as if unsure whether protocol demanded movement. His suit was immaculate, but the confidence that once animated him had drained away, leaving a careful neutrality behind. He had not slept much. Prosecutors learned to recognize this feeling, the moment when winning stopped being the point. Ethan Brooks rose beside Marcus. He looked different today, too. Not triumphant. Focused. His eyes were steady, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested he finally trusted the ground beneath his feet. He had prepared for every outcome, but he knew which one belonged here. Halverson spoke slowly. "This court has reviewed the evidence submitted under subpoena authority, including redundant system backups and original audio records. These materials demonstrate, conclusively, that the defendant requested appropriate security measures, that such measures were denied by a supervising authority, and that system logs were later altered." A breath moved through the room. "The court further finds," Halverson continued, "that the altered logs were presented as original evidence, materially misrepresenting the sequence of events." He paused, then said the words that mattered. "Marcus Coleman is found not guilty on all counts. The evidence shows intentional manipulation of records. This matter is referred for further investigation." The gavel came down, not hard, not soft. Final. For a moment, nothing happened. The room seemed to hold its breath as if waiting for permission to believe what it had heard. Then the bailiff stepped forward and unlocked the cuffs. The sound was small, almost insignificant, but Marcus felt it echo through him. Metal released skin. Weight lifted. He flexed his fingers once, slowly, grounding himself in the sensation of freedom returning not as a rush, but as a certainty. He did not smile. He simply stood straighter. Ethan exhaled and allowed himself a quiet nod. He didn't reach out. He didn't need to. Some moments didn't require touch to be shared. In the gallery, Rachel Moore lowered her notebook and finally let herself feel it. Relief came first, then a steady resolve. She had already submitted the follow-up piece naming the investigators assigned to the case and outlining the steps ahead. Awards didn't matter to her. Not yet. What mattered was that the story had changed something. Outside the courtroom doors, cameras waited. Marcus stepped out into the light, flanked by Ethan on one side and a federal marshal on the other, though the marshal's presence now felt ceremonial rather than necessary. Microphones rose. Shutters clicked. A reporter called out, "Mr. Coleman, how does it feel to be cleared?" Marcus stopped. He turned toward the cluster of faces, the lenses inches away. His expression was calm, composed, the same one he'd worn when everything was uncertain. "I don't need to be vindicated," he said evenly. "I just need the truth not to be buried." The words landed without drama. They didn't need it. Ethan watched from the edge of the frame, a small smile tugging at his mouth. He would be offered things now. He already had been. A senior partner from a respected firm had called the night before, voice smooth, praising his composure, his instincts, his restraint. Ethan had thanked him and said he'd think about it. He wasn't chasing prestige. He was choosing direction. Across town, Luis Herrera sat in a quiet campus office, filling out enrollment forms with hands that shook less than they used to. He had lost his job at the port 2 weeks earlier. No explanation, no appeal. But a scholarship advisor had looked at his transcript and his recommendations and nodded with genuine interest. Cybersecurity, network integrity, systems that couldn't be bent quietly. Luis felt fear still, but it no longer ruled him. He had learned that silence cost more than speaking, and education was the only shield he trusted. That evening, Rachel Moore stood in a crowded hall under warm lights as her name was called. The award plaque felt heavier than she expected, smooth and cool against her palm. When she spoke, briefly, she didn't mention herself. She mentioned sources, systems, the quiet courage of people who told the truth without knowing whether it would save them. Marcus watched the ceremony later from a small living room couch, the television volume low. The room belonged to Sarah Coleman, his older sister, a woman in her late 30s with a tall, slender frame and a posture that suggested she had learned to stand between storms. Her hair was worn natural, pulled back loosely, streaked with a few threads of gray she refused to hide. Sarah's kindness was not loud. It was deliberate. Years earlier, she had raised Marcus after their mother's death, working 2 jobs and learning the cost of endurance. That history had shaped her into someone who believed in patience but not surrender. She set a mug of tea on the table in front of him. "You okay?" Marcus nodded. "Yeah." She studied him for a moment, then smiled. "Good. Dinner's almost ready." A dog stirred at Marcus's feet. Rook, a black and tan shepherd mix, 5 years old, with alert ears and a calm demeanor that mirrored Marcus's own. Rook had been adopted from a shelter during Marcus's first year home from service. He was steady, observant, loyal without being anxious. Marcus scratched behind his ears, feeling the quiet comfort of something that didn't ask questions. Later that night, after dishes were washed and the house settled into sleep, Marcus stepped outside onto the porch. The city hummed softly, traffic distant, the harbor lights blinking steadily across the water. He breathed in the cool air and let the day settle. Justice, he thought, wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it arrived after exhaustion, after loss, after doubt, and stayed only if people refused to let it be pushed aside. Inside, his phone buzzed once. A message from Ethan. "Proud of you. Get some rest?" Marcus typed back. "We all did our part?" He looked out at the quiet street, the light pooling beneath the lamppost, and allowed himself one final release of tension. Not celebration, not relief, just peace. Marcus Coleman didn't win because he was louder than the system. He didn't win because he was perfect or powerful or protected. He won because he refused to trade truth for comfort. This story isn't really about a courtroom, a corrupted file, or a verdict read aloud under bright lights. It's about how easily silence can be used as a weapon, and how dangerous it becomes when the wrong people decide whose voice matters. Marcus showed us something most systems don't like to admit: that integrity often looks like stubbornness, that restraint is mistaken for weakness, and that people who follow the rules are sometimes punished by those who bend them. Justice, in the end, did not arrive with applause. It arrived slowly, through records that remembered what people tried to erase, through witnesses who chose fear and spoke anyway, through one man who stood still when it would have been easier to disappear. The lesson is simple, but not easy. Truth doesn't need to shout. It needs someone willing to stand with it long enough to be heard. And sometimes, the bravest thing a person can do is not to fight back, but to stay honest in a world that profits from lies.